I think voters are fed up with the way our government spends its money, fed up with the fact that last year our government took in more tax dollars than in any year in the history of the Commonwealth prior to last year, fed up with the fact that last year we had $1 billion surplus, and there was a bill that came to the floor that would have mandated that the legislature send that $1 billion surplus back to cities and towns, and that bill was voted down overwhelmingly along party lines. And my opponent said time after time in our debates that she thinks we need to move away from assessing blame and talking about who's to blame and how we got to where we are, and just all kind of join hands and move forward. We need to find out how we got where we are, and how we got where we are is very simple. The people who we elected to represent us made some terrible decisions. They ought to be held accountable for that. Last year we had $1 billion surplus, $1 billion surplus. And yet, not enough local aid came back to our town, to Holliston, our town, or to Hopkinton, or to any of the other towns in our district, to fund so basic a service as school buses for our kids. That's unacceptable. And rather than continue to say, we will allow you, legislature, to continue to get away with this, to continue with paying lip service to the notion that public education is a priority while you continue to underfund it, we need to draw a line and say, no more. And my opponent's reaction to that in the Metro West Daily News was to say she'd like to look at the law currently requires, state law currently requires free school busing for anyone who lives more than 2 miles from a school. And that's why a fee was imposed on a certain subset of parents whose kids who live within two miles.
Just like my house was.
She said she wanted to look at changing that law so that everyone would have to pay a smaller amount. That's a new tax. I want to look at changing that law to require that school busing be provided for everybody. But that's a tax, and her immediate reaction is to turn and say, we all ought to go deeper into our pockets to solve this problem, rather than to turn and say, why is it that the legislature voted along party lines against a bill that would have sent $1 billion surplus back to cities and towns, which would have been somewhere near $1 million for every town in our district?
Will you be willing to join me in promising tonight that you will vote against any and all tax increases, at least until our budget is balanced?
Well, I will again agree with Dan that we need to enact reforms and, carefully manage our spending before we even consider any kind of revenue increases. What I can't do right now is, especially considering we have a significant transportation backlog in maintenance of our roads and bridges, which in my opinion constitutes, and in fact in the opinion of the Transportation Finance Commission, constitutes a very real potential public safety issue. We need to look at every possible alternative for filling that gap, but if there are no other alternatives for addressing a potential public safety issue, I certainly cannot take any options off the table, including any kind of approach to generating new revenue sources.
It's been years that people running for office and people in office have said, oh, last resort, we'll go, tax increases are a last resort. And yet our tolls keep going up, our taxes keep going up. Everyone talks about the need to attract new business, but the legislature at the end of this session added $1 billion in new business taxes.
My reputation is one of not shying away from the tough issues, many of which I think we need to tackle and tackle very actively at the State House, and something I will do if I'm elected.
Something you want to add to that?
Without promising not to support any tax increases is the addendum to that. And I promise not to support any tax increases.
Under any way, shape, or form?
Any way, shape, or
form. I think we're clear on that.
Yeah, when the Metro West Daily News on Sunday endorsed me, and I was very pleased to receive their endorsement, not only for the fact of the endorsement, which is of course nice, but for their reasoning. Because it reflected what I've been saying all along. They said, in order to reform the way our state government does business, in order to get rid of cronyism and backroom dealing and behind closed doors government, we need to elect more Republicans. We need to elect more members of the minority party. We do not have a functioning two-party system in our government right now. We don't. And it's not Carolyn's fault that she would represent a step in the wrong direction by replacing a member of the minority with yet another member of the supermajority, but that's a fact. Carolyn has said before, and she said at the very beginning of this campaign to the Metro West Daily News again, that she thinks she'd be a good legislator because she's a Democrat. She can work with other Democrats to support, to get them to support her programs. My point of view, that's exactly the problem with our state government right now. Members of the supermajority going literally behind closed doors this year to negotiate our budget And what the chair of the Rules Committee said when asked by a reporter, how can you justify negotiating our budget behind closed doors? He said that's the members like to do it that way. The members line up before the gentleman from Ways and Means and tell him their priorities. They do that in the Democratic caucus chamber. Now that is an excess of members going behind closed doors saying we're part of the same party, we'll support each other's programs, and blowing way past the point where they've spent all the money we have to the point where we have a $1.2 billion deficit that we have to deal with mere months into our budget cycle.
Because of congestion issues, I don't favor taking down the tolls simply because I believe it will put more traffic on the pike and it will put more cars in the city when we're already challenged to accommodate the traffic that we have.
And to her credit, my opponent has been very firm. She said we shouldn't take down tolls. Taking down tolls is not the direction we want to head. Taking down tolls is not in our long-term interests. She said she wants to expand tolls. She wants to put them back on the Western Pike, where Governor Weld took them down a number of years ago. I was very pleased to see Governor Patrick 2 weeks ago now say that in his revamp of the state's transportation system, it is his hope, and he was speaking first person, it is my hope that we can take down the tolls on the Massachusetts Turnpike, other than the ones at the state border. That is much closer to my position, take down all the tolls, than to my opponent's position, leave the ones we have, put them back on the Western Pike, and put them everywhere else.
Carolyn?
I stand by what I said, and the question originally was about merging the two authorities. I've heard a lot of inefficiencies. A couple of them related to tolls could be addressed without a merger and should be before agreeing whether or not to support a merger. I want to see the numbers. I want to see specific savings. There have been suggestions made that while there may be some slim savings, there may be inefficiencies created in other areas through a merger. I just want to see the information before I, come out and commit one way or another.
And I just can't understand how someone runs for office in Metro West and takes as their first premise, well, you need to prove to me that eliminating the Turnpike is a good thing. I'm going to assume it's not until you prove it. I just don't get that. That is not what I hear from the voters out here. What bothers me is my opponent makes much of this notion that she'd be independent, she'll stand up to these special interests and everything else. And at the same time, my wife's a Democrat, so I get these mailers in my mailbox. We've gotten 3 from one union. And I pay for my own mailings out of contributions that I raise one at a time. Each mailing represents dozens and dozens of contributions, so I know what they cost. We're talking about, she's received three mailers by one union and one by a PAC. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of a value of $20,000, which matches or exceeds the amount of money that she herself has raised and spent on her campaign.
So Dan, in 90 seconds or less, state how the voters will be better off with your election rather than your opponent.
Sure, and David, thank you for doing this tonight. It was very useful, again. I'll return to the Metro West Daily News' endorsement of my candidacy this Sunday. And as I said, I was very pleased to receive it, not just for the fact of it. I was very pleased to receive the endorsement of the Worcester Telegram and Gazette and the Boston Herald as well, but for their reasoning, because their reasoning talked both about the big picture and about me specifically. Big picture is, we're in a situation in this state of our own making, and it stems directly from the fact that our legislature is dominated by one party, and it doesn't matter which party it is. I've said time after time that I think if we had 141 Republicans in our legislature and only 19 Democrats, we'd have the same kind of nonsense going on. It's not a partisan issue. It's just a matter of good government. When all control, total control, is in the hands of one party, you get the kind of nonsense we have going on. You get government behind closed doors. You get a budget surplus of $1 billion spent within a few months into a budget deficit of over $1 billion. I represent a step in the right direction there. My opponent, through no fault of her own, represents a step in the wrong direction. She would again she would add more to the minority. They also mentioned my experience getting things done. They called me a moderate who knows the way Beacon Hill works and can take on entrenched bureaucracies, and I appreciated that. I ask for your vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.